Still to come on our program, the vicious cycle of tariffs continues in the U.S.-China trade war. How have all the educators and the intellectuals coming from both countries reacted to this trade dispute? We'll be back with this. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. The ongoing trade war between China and the U.S. has definitely put a strain on the political relations. Efforts to de-escalate the trade war have been made from both sides, but so far have been ineffective. Have China and the U.S. enter a vicious cycle of mutual distrust? It will be interesting to see how educators and intellectuals from the two countries react to this. Recently, I sat down with Mark Elliot, Vice Provost of the International Affairs from Harvard University, and Da Wei, Assistant President from the University of International Relations in China. Before we start our discussion, take a look at this.
All eyes were on Donald Trump on Wednesday. Once again, the U.S. president didn't fail to shock with his words.
Regrettably, we found that China has been attempting to interfere in our upcoming 2018 election. They do not want me or us to win because I am the first president ever to challenge China on trade.
The U.S. president provided no evidence to his claims, and China's top diplomat, sitting just 2 seats away, refuted the allegation.
We do not and will not interfere in any country's in domestic affairs. We refuse to accept any unwarranted accusations against China.
The exchange took place during a United Nations Security Council meeting. 2 days before, the latest and largest round of U.S. tariffs went into effect. America's trade war with China now affects $250 billion worth of Chinese imports. On Monday, China published a white paper which aims to prove that China-U.S. trade benefits both sides, and cooperation is the only way forward. However, there has still been no sign of an olive branch from the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Tensions are rising on all fronts for the world's 2 largest economies, from trade to politics to military ties. Just how much more weight can these strained China-U.S. relations take is the question that worries the world.
As academic leaders going on between China and the United States, where are we now? What does it mean to what you are doing right here?
U.S.-China relations right now are not the best. They have been better, but that they will be better again. We just need to figure out a way to get through the present difficulties, and that there is more that unites us than separates us. That's my
takeaway in a way
on this. Yeah.
But how to do that is a bigger question, isn't it, Professor Da? You've been doing China-U.S. relation research for decades. Let me ask you about this. There's a danger that the suspicions from both sides about each other is getting ever deeper as a result of the recent apparent trade war between the two countries and the strategic relationship for the future. Professor Da, are we heading for a vicious cycle about mutual suspicion?
Yes, I think we are facing this kind of danger. We need to be very, very careful, particularly in the process of dealing with this so-called trade war or trade friction. Now, of course, China and the U.S. are engaged in several rounds of negotiations. But the problem or the challenge is, from China's side, having seen recent U.S. Trump administration's action towards China, for instance, very strong, very heavy pressure on China on trade issue. Some Chinese even think humiliating negotiation condition in the previous discussion, the previous negotiation. Many Chinese has drawn a conclusion that is the Trump administration or maybe the U.S. government has already developed a strategy to contain China. If we Chinese believe that the U.S. is going to contain us, then we may ask, why should we negotiate with the U.S. on economic issue? Why should we make compromise? So that will, make China feel we need to be very, very firm. Again, when China behave in that way, the American side will say, hey, it's meaningless to negotiate with Chinese. They will not make compromise, no matter what we ask, what we request. So this is a vicious cycle, as you mentioned. Right. So if we follow that path, I think we will slip into kind of new Cold War, this kind of thing.
That's going to be the danger, Professor Elliot.
The danger right now is real. We are at a very sensitive moment. Back in 1972, when President Nixon came to China in his historic visit and met with Chairman Mao, and they had their conversation, and near the end of the conversation, according to the accounts that I'm familiar with anyway, Chairman Mao said, well, we will still have to scold you in the newspapers. But you understand, that's just what we have to do for the newspapers.
Where did you read that from?
Oh, that's a story I've seen many places. I'm sure that Dr. Kissinger refers to it in his accounts, but that's something that we see in a number of sources. The thing that matters is to make sure that we separate perceptions and reality. Yes. And in order to do that, requires trust, and it requires turning to the relationships that have been built over many, many years, which happily remain, I think, very strong. Statements, whoever they may be made by, and for whatever reason they may need to be made.
Right.
We don't let those statements get in the way of real conversations around real things that matter.
But Professor Elliot, I would argue the direction you just argued for is extremely challenging, because we all understand now there's a Washington that is in big dogfight right now, leading up to the midterm election. There's also the issue of the huge divide between the Trump administration and many of what they call the elites like you, who consciously aware about the importance of bilateral relations and who consciously want to make sure that the policies and the directions of the policies are in the right place. So how can we overcome all of these gaps within the United States itself?
I don't have a great deal of inside information, unfortunately, to share with you. It does seem to me, though, from what I understand, that even within the Trump administration, we have a variety of different views. So here again, I think it's important to bear in mind that the situation is always going to be more complex than it looks from the outside. Once you get in and you start talking to different people in different parts of the government, you understand that a policy or position that eventually emerges will be the result of negotiations both between the Chinese side and the American side, but also within the American side and within the Chinese side.
So, Professor Da, Professor Elliot is making it very clear that China really needs to separate what is being said rhetorically by some of the few political leaders inside Washington. Can China and will China be able to do that?
I think China can distinguish these two things. Having said that, I must emphasize that there is a difficulty because we are here in Beijing, we are not in DC, we are not in New York. I think there is a difficulty to understand accurately what is the reality there. I will say, generally speaking, the so-called strategic community in the United States, in that community, I mean, their attitude towards China become much tougher. I think this is a reality. But their attitude is different from Trump administration. Well, in the Trump administration, there are, of course, as
different voices too.
Yeah, there are differences. So we need to distinguish that very, very carefully. Some people just want to keep China.
Right. But Professor Da, here's the issue that's related to both what you have been talking about, which is, do we have enough amount and quality of exchanges between the two sides, even in the academic circle, to understand really the sophistication and the nuances about how they see each other and also how they see themselves right now? Professor Da, very briefly.
Yeah, the short answer is no. I think we need two kinds of interaction, dialogues. The one is between the two leaders, two presidents, because both our leaders are very strong leaders, so they need to meet face-to-face. But unfortunately, this year, 2018, they haven't met separately. I don't know if they will meet sometimes later this year. It's possible, but not sure. I think this is something we need very urgently. The other level is the people-to-people. For instance, students to students, scholar to scholar. But unfortunately, the level of exchanges at that level, I think, has decreased in recent 1 year. I think the people-to-people exchanges in our two countries, between our two countries, are facing extremely difficulty situation.
But Professor Elliot, we noticed that over the past few months, there were media reports suggesting even the President of the United States, in a private occasion, talking about Chinese students and labeling them as the so-called spies. Almost all of them are spies. Of course, the White House has not necessarily confirmed that quote. How important it is that we treat the students from both sides equally, while at the same time with full respect.
International students at Harvard account for roughly 22 to 23%.
Yes.
And the largest single group of those international students comes from China. That's a number somewhere around 850 students.
Every year?
Every year. Harvard would not be Harvard were it not for the very large number of international students, including obviously Chinese students. Does the university need to pay attention to national security issues? Of course. Every university does. Universities in China do as well. We understand that perfectly well. But to make, again, we don't know whether those comments were in fact uttered and what the context was or anything like that.
Right.
But to make irresponsible statements, I think, really does not do anybody any favors.
Professor Da, on the other hand, what about on Chinese university campuses? How much the debate and the apparent deteriorating relationship between China and the United States is having an impact on your students' understanding?
I will say the image of the U.S. among Chinese students has deteriorated greatly in past 1 year. All my students, they study international relations. They follow those developments very closely. And I think the information they get are basically negative. So this is very worrisome, I think, for China-U.S. relations. I always believe that the younger generation are relatively optimistic than people like me. If they have chance, they need to go to the U.S. They will see that basically, I mean, the general attitude in the U.S. towards China has not changed. And it's different. I mean, the administration's policy is different from public opinion, public image.
I'm not actually sure. If I just one brief reply here, I think that unfortunately a lot of public opinion toward China has become more negative.
From both of your perspective, how shall we see to it that perceptions could be closer to realities, no matter what is the version of realities that you believe in? Professor Da, I'll let you go first.
First one is, of course, communication. If you communicate with the other side frequently, and even you live in that country, of course, your knowledge about that country will be much closer to the reality. The other thing is, I will call it training or education. I think we need to educate, educate ourselves. We should give up an idea or belief that I am absolutely correct. The other side, they are wrong. I'm on the right side of the history. They are on the wrong side.
Professor Da is saying, well, let's just be a little bit more empathetic toward one another. Let's try to be able to see the other sides of the story. Is it possible?
I think certainly it's possible. And I think that I can come back to the question of perceptions.
You're being a professor or you're being a realist when you're saying that? Or a combination of both?
I guess I would hope to think it's a combination of both.
Realist, professor.
We have, for instance, to use the example you brought up a little earlier, the question of the Chinese perceptions that America is trying to contain China. And then American perceptions that in the China 2025 plan, this is China's plan for domination of world technology. China has the right to its own industrial plans. Every country has those sorts of things. The key here is to create a situation in which you can, I'll use the Chinese expression, 下台.
What is it? For many of our viewers from outside China, they might not understand.
So my understanding of this is you don't want to put somebody in a position where they 下不了台.
You don't want to put somebody on the spot.
You don't want to put them on the spot. You don't want to put them in a corner where they don't have a graceful exit. And I think this is actually a very good lesson in life, whether you're Chinese or American or
in personal life too.
Personal life as well. It's a way of showing, understanding respect and the other person's position. So, again, I think that it's unquestionably a difficult moment. There are things that I think need to change on the Chinese side, from what I understand of the issues that have been presented. And there are certainly things on the American side as well that can be done better and need to change too. So we get beyond the rhetoric and get beyond the posing and the positioning, get beyond the November elections where people are saying things in order to achieve points, and then we will be in a much better position.
Can we get beyond November midterm elections, Professor Da? There are several issues crucial. Of course, geopolitics is crucial, how China and U.S. are going to see each other. There's also the issue of innovation, how the two sides are going to shape themselves about the issue of innovation and interact with one another about the innovation. There's also the issue of peace and stability of the world. Both sides are having the responsibilities to do that. There's as well the issues of how the international institutions would work for the future, how the both sides are going to be, the roles they play in those institutions. So Professor Da, about that, can we look beyond midterm election? Even after the midterm election, can we really move beyond?
The midterm election is important for us. The reason is, I think current difficulty, I would say part of our current difficulty is due to the U.S. domestic politics, or very special administration in Washington, D.C. So of course, we should look beyond this election. And this is a midterm election. It's not a presidential election. It's about local and state politics. I will argue, actually, this election is not directly related to China-U.S. relations. But why we pay attention to that? Because we want to know the future, the political formation in the U.S., in Washington, D.C. next year. And the situation in D.C. Next year will directly influence the negotiation and the status of U.S.-China relations next year.
Professor Elliot?
There's a kind of periodicity that has come to characterize.
That's an interesting phrase.
U.S.-China relations these days, and it works on both sides. The mechanisms are different, but there's I think if you look at the effect that the midterm elections are having on the U.S.-China relationship, an effect that I would say 10, certainly 20 years ago, nobody in China even knew what midterm elections were. And now everyone is paying a lot of attention to it. By the same token, in the United States, if you follow China affairs, you're very aware now of the party congresses, of the meetings of the Zhengxie, the People's Political Consultative Conference, every March, and that certain decisions won't happen until one or another of those events have taken place, and those have also repercussions for the U.S.-China relationship. So between the usually October, November Party Congress meeting and the CPCC meeting in the spring and our election cycle, that's where you get this, what I call this periodicity, where there's a kind of a cycle to the relationship.
So can we look beyond?
Well, we have to, don't we? We don't have any choice.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
谢谢。